1993. It is interesting, I think, to note that the original bequest of $5,000, which started this lecture series in 1893, was made by Miss Caroline Haskell Ingersoll from her own estate to honor her father, George Goldthwaite Ingersoll, who was a Harvard alumnus, AB 1815, and took an STB in this institution in 1845. Died in 1863. Ms. Haskell stipulated that the lecture not form a part of the usual college course, which it does not and has not ever, and it was not to be delivered by any professor or tutor as a part of his usual routine of instruction, and that we try to avoid as well. The Ingersoll, at that time, title On the Immortality of Man, I think it's telling that that has been dropped. We now have it on the Ingersoll lecture on immortality, was to be given once a year on the model of the Dudleyan. The choice of the lecture was not to be restricted to any one denomination or profession, and we have followed that, I think, even better in recent years. Ms. Ingersoll further directed that the lecture should be made available to the public gratis in written form. So these were the essence of the terms, which are a little bit longer than what I've given you. We have had for this lectureship a roster of extremely distinguished speakers, including William James as the second Ingersoll lecturer in 1897, Josiah Royce in 1899, Harry Emerson Fosdick, 1927, George Lyman Kittredge, the great English scholar here in the English department, 1937, Alfred North Whitehead in 1941, Howard Thurman, 1947, Harry Wolfson in 1956, Werner Jaeger in 1958, Paul Tillich in 1962, and Yaroslav Pelikan in 1963. I'm happy, though, to say that it's not just a roster of men to talk about the immortality of man, but in fact, the first woman, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, presented the Ingersoll lecture in 1970, and since has been followed by a series of distinguished female colleagues, among them Caroline Bynum, formerly a colleague of everyone here, Anna Marie Schimmel, my teacher and former colleague, Wendy Doniger, and our own Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs currently, Jane Idleman Smith, who gave them, I believe, in 77. Tonight's esteemed speaker, Professor Leora Batnitzky from Princeton, will be the 91st speaker in the long series of great scholars who have graced and inspired the community here through the decades with these lectures. So it is a privilege, actually, to be able to be here to introduce these lectures. Before I bring our introducer, our formal introducer, forward, let me invite everyone afterwards to a reception at the end of the hall. If you go to your right and go as far as you can go to the Brown Room, and after the lecture and question and answer period, we will repair there, and there is a kosher reception for everyone, except that I understand the wine is not kosher, so if you're dependent on that being kosher, I'm sorry, we seem not to have managed on that, but I think that everything else is certainly kosher. So let me now turn to my colleague, John D. Levinson, Albert A. List Professor of Jewish Studies, here to introduce Professor Batnitzky. John?
Thank you, Dean Graham, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's Ingersoll lecture on immortality. Our lecturer today is Leora Batnitzky, Professor of Religion at Princeton University, on whose faculty she has served since 1997. Professor Batnitzky has also taught at the University of Tokyo and Syracuse University, and 2 years ago, she was the Hauser Fellow in Global Law at New York University Law School. Among Professor Batnitzky's many awards and honors are a Mellon New Directions Fellowship, the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton, the Olga and William Lackritz Martin Buber Prize at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and 3 prizes for academic excellence that she garnered during her years as an undergraduate at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, concentrating in biblical studies, while also doing another bachelor's degree in philosophy at Barnard College. Her doctorate is from Princeton in religion. Now let me move on to the positive stuff. Leora Batnitzky has published 2 books, with 2 others now in progress. Her first volume, Idolatry and Representation, The Philosophy of Franz Rosenzweig Reconsidered, is one of the most profound explorations of Rosenzweig's thought. It examines Rosenzweig's philosophical, theological, aesthetic, linguistic, and social thinking in a way that is influenced by recent intellectual currents, but not subordinate to them. In the process, the freshness and challenge of Rosenzweig's thought appear anew and in full force. Her second book, Leo Strauss and Emanuel Levinas, Philosophy and the Politics of Revelation, is a different sort of work, again deeply philosophical, but here, as befits the subject, political philosophy and ethics are more the focus. I won't attempt to summarize either of these volumes now, and indeed they are too sophisticated to lend themselves to brief summarization. Instead, I'll rest content with citing my favorite sentence in the second book, one that is all the more challenging given the high estimation in which Levinas is held in religious studies circles today. Levinas's God, Professor Batnitzky writes, is not godly. His religion is not religious, and his politics is not political. End of quote. The subject, this evening, her subject is From Resurrection to Immortality, Theological and Political Implications in Modern Jewish Thought. Please join me in welcoming Professor Leora Batnitzky.
Okay, that's okay? Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here, and I'd like to thank Dean Graham for having me, and the Divinity School for having me, and Professor Levinson. That was by far the nicest introduction I've ever had. Thank you. And Janine McCullen, who did so much to help me get here. So thank you. Now, I'm going to start my lecture actually by referring to an Ingersoll lecture that Dean Graham did not refer to. It's my favorite. I haven't read them all, but but I really like this, and that's Hans Jonas's 1961 Ingersoll lecture. Hans Jonas began his 1961 Ingersoll lecture by acknowledging the undeniable fact, quote, that the modern temper is uncongenial to the idea of immortality. Jonas nonetheless concluded his lecture by affirming that, quote, although the hereafter is not ours, we can have immortality, when in our brief span we serve our threatened mortal affairs and help the suffering immortal God, end quote. Perhaps more than he knew, Jonas's words capture what I will argue is the dominant view of immortality in modern Jewish thought, whose main purpose is to defy an utterly materialist conception of human existence without committing to any particularly theological or traditionally metaphysical notion of immortality. Like Jonas, I'm deliberately using the term immortality in a very loose sense to refer to the idea that the meaning of human life transcends human finitude or mortality. This very vague notion of immortality suggests that there is some dimension of an individual's life that endures after death, whether in the form of a soul or in the remnants of an individual's deeds. Thinkers as philosophically and ideologically diverse as Moses Mendelssohn, the father of German Jewish thought and a theorist of modern liberalism, Samson Raphael Hirsch, the intellectual father of modern orthodoxy, Hermann Cohen, the neo-Kantian liberal German Jewish philosopher, Franz Rosenzweig, the existentialist Jewish philosopher, and Emmanuel Levinas, the French phenomenologist often associated with postmodernism, all affirm a minimal but assured position that the material world, whether defined by the laws of nature or by the facts of our historical contexts, does not and cannot fully capture the meaning of our humanity. My interest, though, is less in the details of various Jewish thinkers' claims about immortality, though I'm going to get into some of those details, than in the purpose claims about or gestures toward immortality serve in modern Jewish thought. An important clue is not just what modern Jewish thinkers say about immortality, but also what they don't say, as John Levinson has pointed out so well and reminded us all. In pre-modern Jewish thought, meaning biblical, rabbinic, and medieval, conceptions of immortality went hand in hand with the conception of resurrection. In contrast, modern Jewish thinkers either reject or downplay or make no mention of resurrection, while nonetheless affirming a conception of immortality. So the question I'd like to explore is, why do modern Jewish thinkers retain a notion of immortality but not of resurrection? The answer can't be, I don't think, because resurrection is more philosophically embarrassing than immortality is. This may have been the perception in the context of 18th century rationalist philosophy and late 19th century neokantian philosophy, though, as I'll argue in the cases of both Moses Mendelssohn and Hermann Cohen, the story is far more complex than this. But considered in the frameworks of a number of modern philosophical schools, such as existentialism and phenomenology, modern Jewish affirmations of immortality are surprising because immortality would seem to be as problematic as resurrection. However, modern Jewish support for immortality and rejection of resurrection is less surprising when considered in the context of the theological political framework of modern Judaism, in which, like political modernity more broadly, religion, seemingly at least, is divorced from politics. As modern Europeans debated whether to grant Jews rights of citizenship in the modern nation-state, modern Jewish thinkers of a variety of ideological stripes were continually at pains to emphasize that the Jewish community did not and would not constitute a state within a state. The Jewish religion, they argued, did not demand any sort of political loyalty that would be in tension with the loyalty required by the state. In making this argument, these diverse Jewish thinkers all equated politics only with a modern nation-state, and all contended that Judaism was not political. Within this framework, I'd like to suggest that because resurrection was associated with collective identity in classical Jewish thought, many modern Jewish thinkers had trouble acknowledging such a concept. The idea of immortality, in contrast, offers the possibility of affirming the enduring value and significance of the Jewish tradition, while simultaneously confirming that there's no tension between being Jewish and a citizen of the modern nation-state. The problem of resurrection is thus less a philosophical problem than a political problem. We will see that Spinoza's critique of Maimonides on this topic and Moses Mendelssohn's subsequent attempt to argue for Jewish emancipation in the context of Spinoza's critique proved the turning points after which the terms of modern Jewish considerations of immortality were set. The omission of resurrection, combined with the retention of immortality in modern Jewish thought, is a movement away from the Jewish tradition as it was historically conceived in its twin theological and political dimensions toward making Judaism into what we call today religion, or in even more contemporary terms, a movement from religion to spirituality. As such, as I will suggest in the conclusion of my talk, the omission of resurrection, combined with the retention of immortality in modern Jewish thought, raises questions not just about modern Judaism, but also about the place and limits of religion in modern politics. Now, I won't belabor the point that everyone who hasn't done so should read John Levinson's work, Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel, and also the work together with Kevin Madigan on resurrection, which is also a great book, looking at Jewish and Christian views of resurrections. But I'll only mention from Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel two basic points that Levinson makes, which are essential for our discussion. First, as the title indicates, the notion of resurrection goes hand in hand with the restoration of Israel. Certainly the history of Jewish thought, rabbinic or otherwise, does not present one systematic view of immortality or resurrection. However, it's helpful to recognize that from a classical rabbinic point of view, resurrection is not individual but collective. I take it that an expansive dimension of resurrection is central to the Christian vision of resurrection as well, and here I quote only from Oscar Coleman's 1955 Ingersoll lecture. I didn't read them all, but I read some. Quote, "The Christian hope relates not just to my individual fate, but to the entire creation," end quote. Second, as Levinson succinctly concludes his book, quote, "To the rabbis, resurrection without the restoration of Israel, including its renewed adherence to the Torah, was incomprehensible. And without the expectation of resurrection, the restoration of Israel would be something less than what the rabbis thought the Torah had always intended it to be, the ultimate victory of the God of life," end quote. Put another way, the theological and political dimensions of resurrection cannot be separated. From the perspective of classical Jewish thought, theology without politics, that is, the miracle of resurrection without the restoration of the particular people of Israel who newly commit to the observance of God's law, is as problematic as politics without theology, or the restoration of Israel without the ultimate miracle of the God of life. At stake in appreciating the interconnection between resurrection and the restoration of Israel in classical Jewish thought is the very question of Jewish election itself. The intimate interplay between resurrection and the restoration of Israel suggests that resurrection, the ultimate redemption of history, cannot be detached from the particular fate of the people of Israel. To be sure, the eschatological redemption marked by resurrection is universal, but the path towards universality cannot be detached from Israel's specific destiny. In Rabbinic Judaism, the status of resurrection and the relation between Jewish particularity and universality come together in the very well-known discussion in the final chapter of the Tractate Sanhedrin of the Babylonian Talmud. Quote, "All of Israel have a share in the world to come, as it is written, and your people, all of them righteous, shall possess the land for all time. They are the shoot that I planted, my handiwork in which I glory. And these are those who do not have a share in the world to come. He who says the resurrection of the dead is not in the Torah, he who says that the Torah is not from heaven, and the skeptic who denies God's providence." End quote. Now, clearly, from a rabbinic point of view, belief in resurrection of the dead is essential. All of Israel has a place in the world to come, but those who deny resurrection remove themselves from the community of Israel, thereby denying themselves a place among the newly born people. But do others, that is, non-Jews, have a place in the world to come? Does not the God of life, who restores the people of Israel, restore all righteous people to life and not just Jews? The rabbis debated this question and offered a number of opinions, including Rabbi Joshua's, which suggested that those righteous Gentiles who followed the 7 laws of Noah after the flood also have a share in the world to come. Maimonides' interpretation of Rabbi Joshua's opinion would be decisive for modern Jewish understandings of immortality and resurrection. So let's turn first to Maimonides' view of resurrection and then to modern Jewish interpretations of Maimonides' view. Now, Maimonides, as many of you probably know, is well known not just for what he said about resurrection, but for what he didn't say. In particular, in the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides doesn't mention resurrection, but he does make arguments about the immortality of the soul. And this omission of resurrection wasn't lost on Maimonides' critics, and he was vehemently accused of and attacked for denying the resurrection of the body. Toward the end of his life, Maimonides responded to his critics with his treatise on resurrection, in which he explicitly embraced the doctrine of resurrection. Quote, "We vehemently deny and we cleanse ourselves before the Almighty God of the accusation attributed to us that the soul will never return to the body and that it is impossible for that to occur. For such a denial of the resurrection of the dead leads to the denial of miracles, and the denial of miracles is equivalent to denying the existence of God and the abandonment of our faith. For we consider the resurrection of the dead to be a cardinal principle of the Torah." End quote. Now, there's much to say, and really quite a lot has been said, about the relationship between Maimonides' treatise and his other works and about what Maimonides' views really were. But for our purposes, what matters is that Maimonides emphasizes strongly the intimate and irreducible connection between theology and politics implied by the belief in resurrection. Now, in the quotation from the treatise on resurrection that I just quoted from, it might appear as if resurrection were purely a theological matter. Again, quote, "For such a denial of the resurrection of the dead leads to the denial of miracles, and the denial of miracles is equivalent to denying the existence of God and the abandonment of our faith," end quote. But understood in the context of Maimonides' broader argument in the Guide of the Perplexed, the denial of resurrection, the denial of miracles, and what is resurrection but the greatest of miracles, destroys, quote, "the Torah of our teacher Moses and reduces to inanity all the hopes and threats that the law of Moses has held out," end quote. So the denial of miracles, Maimonides says in the Guide of the Perplexed, destroys the law itself. So why is that? So that's the question. Why does the denial of miracles destroy the Torah and its laws? For Maimonides, and this is very brief, the possibility of miracles means that that there's the possibility that God created the world. And creation, if God created the world, that implies divine providence, because that means that the world is the way it is for a reason, whatever that reason might be. So if there's no possibility of providence, there's no possibility of revelation and no possibility of the law. So for these reasons, denial of the hope of resurrection, quote, "destroys the Torah and reduces to inanity all the hopes and threats that the law of Moses has held out," end quote. And so just to let me say that, what I'm saying is that in the Guide of the Perplexed, for Maimonides, the denial of miracles is the denial of creation. which is ultimately a denial of the possibility of the law. I mean, he's interested in the possibility. So what I'm trying to show is that this claim about denying miracles, and again, resurrection is the greatest of all miracles, is not just a theological claim. It's also a political claim because it destroys the Torah. And that's what I'm going to say now. The destruction of the Torah in principle, as well as all the hopes and threats that the law has held out, is clearly not just of theological import, but of political significance as well. As Maimonides makes clear throughout his work, the Torah is fundamentally political in nature, and while politics is not the final end of the Torah, the political order is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for any higher spiritual aspirations of the human being. As Maimonides puts it in a very famous quotation in the guide, quote, "The Torah of Moses, our teacher, as a whole aims at two things, the welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body. As for the welfare of the soul, it consists in the multitude acquiring correct opinions. As for the welfare of the body, it comes about by the improvement of their ways of living with one another. This cannot be achieved in any way by one isolated individual, for an individual can only attain all this through a political association, it already being known that man is political by nature," end quote. So however one interprets Maimonides' claims about resurrection in the context of his larger corpus, it's clear that he follows the rabbinic tradition in positing an intimate connection between the theological hope for the miracle of resurrection and the political form this hope would take in restoring the people of Israel. Now, it's precisely the splitting of theology from politics that marks much of modern Jewish thought, and particularly the claims of those Jewish thinkers who emphasize some conception of immortality while attempting to ignore resurrection. As with so many issues in modern Jewish thought, the famous Jewish heretic Baruch Spinoza set the parameters for modern Jewish arguments about immortality. In his theological political treatise, Spinoza denies the possibility of miracles, claiming that such a possibility is in fact a denial of God, because the notion of a miracle implies that God's law is not necessary, and that's a contradiction for Spinoza. Nevertheless, Spinoza seems to affirm some notion of immortality. Quote, "The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains which is eternal," end quote. Now, the meaning of Spinoza's claim about immortality remains as vexed an issue for his interpreters as the meaning of Maimonides' claims about resurrection. Now, what concerns us here, though, is less the philosophical intricacies of Spinoza's position, obviously far beyond the scope of this paper, than the political contention about Judaism he makes in connection with his declaration about immortality. Spinoza writes, quote, "If a man is absolutely ignorant of the Scriptures and nonetheless has right opinions and a true plan of life, he is absolutely blessed and truly possesses in himself the Spirit of Christ. The Jews are of a contrary way of thinking, for they hold that true opinions and a true plan of life are of no service in attaining blessedness, if their possessors have arrived at them by the light of reason only, and not like the documents prophetically revealed to Moses. Maimonides ventures openly to make this assertion," end quote. Spinoza refers here to Maimonides' commentary in his Law of Kings on the Talmudic discussion, already mentioned, at the end of the tractate Sanhedrin about who has a portion in the world to come. So this is what Spinoza is referring to in Maimonides. Quote, "A heathen who accepts the 7 commandments given to Noah and observes them scrupulously is a righteous Gentile and will have a portion in the world to come, provided that he accepts them and performs them because the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded them in the law and made them known through Moses, our teacher. But if his observance is based upon a reason conclusion, he is neither deemed a resident alien nor one of the pious Gentiles," end quote. According to Maimonides, in order to earn a place in the world to come, a non-Jew must not only accept and observe the 7 commandments given to Noah, but he must accept them and perform them, quote, "because the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded them in the law and made them known through Moses," end quote. Now, on the one hand, the acceptance of the source of the law is theological. The righteous Gentile acknowledges that the law comes from God and not from his own reason. But on the other hand, this acceptance is simultaneously political, for the law was given to Moses, who gave the law to the Jewish people. So from Spinoza's perspective, Maimonides' view betrays the meaning of the divine law, which Spinoza defines as, quote, "universal or common to all men," because it does not depend on the truth of any historical narrative whatsoever, end quote. For Maimonides, in contrast, there's no tension between the particular historical narrative of the divine law and its universal implications. In fact, the latter requires the former. Now, clearly there are profound theological and philosophical differences between Maimonides and Spinoza. But on the questions of immortality and resurrection, that is, on the issue of who and who does not have a place in the world to come, their difference is perhaps most fundamentally political. As mentioned, for Maimonides, quote, the law as a whole aims at two things, the welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body, end quote. The political order aims at the welfare of the body, but for Maimonides, the welfare of the body is not an end in itself. Rather, politics is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for the ultimate end of human life, which is contemplation of the divine, or the welfare of the soul. Now, Spinoza follows Maimonides in viewing the goal of human life as the contemplation of the divine, yet Spinoza sees politics as an end in itself. For Spinoza, the aim of the state is, quote, peace and security of life, end quote. Religion or theology for Spinoza is a means toward promoting political harmony. Maimonides' view that the righteous Gentile must exhibit certain behavior and possess certain beliefs is inherently problematic because it depends upon the truth of a particular historical narrative. Spinoza's notion that theological beliefs ought to be judged in accord with their perceived ability to promote a peaceful political order, which, in theory at least, does not value one particular historical narrative above others, came to define the political, philosophical, and theological framework in which modern Jewish thinkers found themselves. The questions of immortality and resurrection thus became as much political problems as they were metaphysical ones. Now, without appreciating the political background of modern Jewish thought, especially in the German Jewish context, it would be easy to conclude that modern Jewish conceptions of immortality simply mirror the philosophical fashions of the day. So, for instance, in his 1783 Jerusalem, Moses Mendelssohn, the father of modern Jewish thought, argued that Judaism in no way contradicted enlightened reason but complemented it. In his 1767 Phaidon, Mendelssohn also offered a sustained Enlightenment argument for the immortality of the soul, making no mention of resurrection. However, Mendelssohn's claims about both Judaism and enlightened reason and about immortality are as much political as they are metaphysical. That is, Mendelssohn's conception of Judaism and his view of immortality conform as much to an idea of a universal enlightened reason as they do to the very modern idea that theological beliefs are to be judged by their ability to contribute to a harmonious political order. Now, as is well known, Mendelssohn published Jerusalem as a response to the public challenge of a Swiss theologian to either refute Christianity or to convert to Christianity. Mendelssohn's problem, whenever I teach Jerusalem, I say, is Mendelssohn was too smart and too successful because people started to say, well, if Mendelssohn's so smart, why doesn't he convert to Christianity? And this got him into big trouble. Now, this was a double-edged challenge because Mendelssohn had to defend the rationality of Judaism and hence Judaism's compatibility with the German Enlightenment without offending his Christian interlocutors. Mendelssohn responded with an eloquent plea for the separation between church and state. The title of Mendelssohn's response, Jerusalem, or On Religious Power in Judaism, captures the thrust of his argument. Mendelssohn argues that by definition the state concerns power and coercion, while religion, properly understood, does not. This means that Judaism or Jerusalem is not concerned with power, and therefore does not conflict with the possibility of the integration of Jews into the modern nation state. Mendelssohn created the very category of Jewish religion by separating Judaism from politics and the individual Jew from the corporate Jewish community. As he put it, the purpose of the Jewish community, quote, is collective edification, participation in the effusion of the heart, through which we acknowledge our gratitude for God's benefactions, end quote. As a political corollary to this philosophical point, Mendelssohn vehemently opposed the idea that the Jewish community should retain its autonomy in matters of civil law, stressing that Jews should receive civil rights as individuals and not as a corporate entity. Mendelssohn especially rejected what still was in his own day the Jewish community's right to excommunicate members of the community. As he put it, Judaism, quote, as religion knows of no punishment, no other penalty than the one the remorseful sinner voluntarily imposes on himself. It knows of no coercion, uses only the staff called gentleness, and affects only mind and heart, end quote. For both theological and political reasons, Mendelssohn was deeply uncomfortable with Maimonides' conceptions of immortality and resurrection. Spinoza's philosophy was, of course, familiar to the German Enlightenment, as was Pierre Bail's claim, derived from Spinoza's criticism of Maimonides, that Judaism was a fundamentally immoral religion. In Mendelssohn's own day, Voltaire had extended this claim in asserting that the Jewish religion was in fact unsurpassed in its moral depravity. Mendelssohn didn't publicly disagree with Maimonides, and he didn't even mention resurrection in any of his works published in German, including in Phaidon, whose expressed purpose is a defense of immortality. However, in his private correspondence, not intended for publication, Mendelssohn expressed his profound discomfort with the political and theological dimensions of Maimonides' views. Quote, "These things are far more difficult for me than flinty rock. Should all the dwellers on earth from east to west, other than ourselves, descend into the pit of perdition and be an object of condemnation to all human beings if they do not believe in the Torah, which was given as an inheritance only to the congregation of Jacob?" End quote. Clearly, Mendelssohn self-consciously recognized that his conception of immortality did not conform to rabbinic doctrine, Maimonidean or otherwise, which, as we have seen, concerns the fate of the people of Israel. The fact that Mendelssohn refused, despite repeated requests, to have Phaidon translated into Hebrew seems to only confirm this fact. Perhaps with Spinoza's criticism of Maimonides in mind, in Phaidon, Mendelssohn stresses that immortality in no way concerns any national or particular group identity. Quote, "I'm of the opinion also that in the very wise plan of creation, similar beings are to meet a similar destiny, and consequently that the same fate awaits the whole human race," end quote. In what is the Phaidon's final argument for immortality, Mendelssohn provides a direct political analog to his philosophical description of the egalitarian nature of immortality. Without immortality, Mendelssohn avers, it would be impossible to reconcile the state's right to demand the sacrifice of the life of any citizen for the welfare of the whole with the individual's competing right to the supreme good of life. Mendelssohn's political argument for immortality amounts to a reductio ad absurdum. The soul is necessarily immortal, Mendelssohn claims, because if it were not, we would be left in what he calls the absurd situation of a general war of moral beings where everyone has right on his side. Now, I'm going to leave aside a consideration of the merits of this argument, because the important point for us is that Mendelssohn wants to be very clear in affirming the right of the state to demand the sacrifice of the life of the citizen, as well as the citizen's individual right to life. In the context in which he was writing, and certainly in regard to questions about the relations between the Jewish community, the state, and the individual Jew, these rights were certainly not taken for granted. Indeed, one of the main objections to Jewish emancipation was that Jews, again, constituted a state within a state and thereby couldn't be trusted to serve in the military. This was a position that Mendelssohn spent much of his intellectual life attempting to dispute. We have seen that while he strongly rejects Spinoza's description of the Jewish view of immortality, Mendelssohn nonetheless follows Spinoza's framework in conceiving the relationship between theology and politics. The theological notion of immortality is inherently egalitarian, Mendelssohn asserts, and thus does not undermine but supports an egalitarian body politic, just as Judaism, as a religion without dogma, does not undermine but supports enlightened reason. Now, when the liberal society that Mendelssohn had hoped for was at least to some extent finally actualized, modern Jewish thinkers continued to defend an idea of immortality similar to his. Strikingly, however, a number of rather diverse modern Jewish thinkers did occasionally mention resurrection, but only as a metaphor for immortality. For instance, Samson Raphael Hirsch, the 19th century spiritual founding father of what is today called Orthodox Judaism, shares with Mendelssohn the tendency to omit resurrection while retaining immortality. Now, Hirsch did not delete the ubiquitous liturgical references to resurrection as his Reform counterparts did. Okay, he couldn't do that. But with remarkable consistency, Hirsch shifts discussion away from resurrection toward immortality, and while doing so, interprets references to the community of Israel as references to individual Jews as well as to all individuals. That all of Israel has a place in the world to come, Hirsch writes, quotes, denotes a twofold future, one in the world to come and one in this world. Whatever good we achieve in loyal obedience to God here below becomes a spiritual accomplishment which will accompany us into the world to come and into the presence of our Father in heaven, end quote. In its universal and theologically vague character, Hirsch's conception of immortality is quite similar to Mendelssohn's. In what is perhaps Hirsch's most succinct statement on the subject, quote, immortality and eternity belong to the essence of man as man, given to everyone as he enters this life to enable him to walk in freedom in the land of transience, to lead him to return to eternity, end quote. But Hirsch's political affinity with Mendelssohn is perhaps more significant and may offer us deeper insight into modern Jewish conceptions of immortality. Although he wrote a century after Mendelssohn wrote, and he wrote as a critic of the liberal Judaism Mendelssohn had fathered, the following words of Hirsch's could just have easily belonged to Mendelssohn, quote, it is certainly possible for us to attach ourselves to the state whenever we may find ourselves without harm to the spirit of Judaism. It is precisely the purely spiritual nature of Israel's nationhood that makes it possible for Jews everywhere to tie themselves to the various states in which they live, end quote. Note Hirsch's repeated use of the term spiritual to describe both immortality and the political status of the Jewish people. Again, immortality is a spiritual accomplishment and Israel's nationhood is purely spiritual. The common ground between Mendelssohn and Hirsch is their shared assumption regarding a necessary boundary between Judaism, now defined as a religion, and politics, now defined only in terms of the egalitarian and individualistic commitments of the modern nation state. Resurrection crosses this boundary and is for this reason troublesome for each of these thinkers. In the early 20th century, the great neokantian Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen similarly reduced resurrection to immortality. Like Mendelssohn, Cohen was deeply disturbed by Spinoza's portrayal of Maimonides. Unlike Mendelssohn, however, Cohen sought not to correct Maimonides but Spinoza, claiming that Spinoza had simply and maliciously misread Maimonides, and that's a view most scholars reject. Most scholars agree that Spinoza read Maimonides correctly. Cohen offers a rereading of Maimonides, quote, all Israel has a share in the world to come. For this share, no special demonstration of positive piety is necessary. The whole of Israel stands here for the concept of man in general. For the whole of Israel includes messianic mankind, end quote. For Cohen, messianic mankind refers not to an eschatological endpoint, but to the worldly pursuit of what he calls ethical socialism, in which material and economic conditions should never become a hindrance to the realization of the moral and spiritual culture of all men without any distinction. While resurrection would seem to demarcate God's miraculous suspension of the laws of creaturely existence, Cohen maintains that the concept of resurrection, quote, became a lever for the formulation of the concept of immortality. The history of the people and the history of the messianic people of mankind endure forever, end quote. Again, for Cohen, the messianic people stands for the concept of man in general. And so for Cohen, the human being's moral task endures forever, and that's his concept of immortality. Now, we might wonder why Cohen mentions resurrection at all. Wouldn't it have been easier simply to ignore resurrection just like Mendelssohn had? Now, here again, I think we see philosophy, theology, and politics converging. Mendelssohn wrote at a time when the Jewish community was still defined as a political entity. For this reason, Mendelssohn was very sensitive to any theological notion that had political implications. As briefly discussed, in order to argue for the full inclusion of Jews into modern political life, Mendelssohn invented the idea that Judaism is a religion. By the time Cohen writes, approximately a century and a half later, This idea that Judaism is religion has been fully internalized by Jewish thinkers. And here, the book I was quoting from, the title Significant, A Religion of Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism, which is intended as a complement and corrective to Kant's Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Resurrection, like all Jewish theological concepts, has been divorced from politics. Resurrection can now serve as an indistinct placeholder for immortality, which we have briefly seen in Cohen's case, is a vague placeholder for the eternal truth of morality. Now, the affirmation of immortality on the one hand and the divorce between theology and politics on the other is perhaps most revealing in the philosophy of Franz Rosenzweig. Rosenzweig begins his magnum opus, The Star of Redemption, quote, "From the fear of death, there commences all knowledge of the all. To cast off the fear of the earthly, to take death from its poisonous sting, in this philosophy deceives itself," end quote. Rejecting the old philosophy for what he calls the new thinking, Rosenzweig would seem to base his thought on the fundamental and inescapable fact of human mortality. Yet the Star of Redemption goes on to declare that, quote, "God's revelation to man is the guarantee of man's entrance into eternity," end quote. Understandably, from the first published reviews of the Star of Redemption to this very day, the central task for students of Rosenzweig has been, in one way or another, to resolve the tension between existence and eternity in his thought, which we won't do tonight. While the star refers repeatedly to eternity, resurrection is mentioned 3 times and only in passing. 2 are in connection with Rosenzweig's discussion of Christianity. The third reference is seemingly generic and somewhat obscure. I'm warning you in advance. This isn't so unusual for Rosenzweig, so let's consider it briefly. Quote, "Everything worldly has its history. Law in the state, art and science, all that is visible. The wake-up call of God's revelation to man sounds, its echo reverberates into the world, and only then does a segment of temporality die the death of the resurrection of eternity." I'll just repeat that. A segment of temporality die the death of the resurrection of eternity. Speech, however, is human, not worldly. Therefore, it neither dies nor, admittedly, is resurrected. In eternity, there is silence. God himself, however, plants the sapling of his own eternity neither into the beginning of time nor into the middle, but utterly beyond time into eternity, end quote. Time, as fleeting as it is, doesn't permit a full discussion of this very complex quotation, but there is one point we can take from it. And that's that Rosenzweig, whatever he means by this, he associates resurrection with time, with death, time, worldliness, history, state, science, and all that is visible, while he links eternity with transcendence, speech, and silence. Later on in the Star, he characterizes Judaism as eternal and the Jewish people's communal life as silence. In contrast, he depicts Christianity and Christians as intrinsically temporal and tied to history, the state, and art. These portrayals imply that the Jewish people are already beyond resurrection because they're eternal. It is Christians and not Jews who await resurrection. Rosenzweig's parsing of eternity and resurrection to Judaism and Christianity, respectively, is part and parcel of his inversion of Christian supersessionism. For Rosenzweig, it's not Judaism that needs to catch up to Christian revelation, as Christians had held for centuries. Rather, as Rosenzweig put it, quote, "To the church we can only say, we have already arrived at the destination. You are still en route," end quote. He's got a lot of good quotes, if you like that. Okay. Rosenzweig's refusal to associate resurrection with Judaism is remarkable, since more than any other German Jewish thinker, he tried to move beyond the framework set in motion by Mendelssohn. But while Rosenzweig emphatically rejected the idea that Judaism is a religion, he nevertheless insisted far more than his predecessors had that Judaism was completely separate from politics. As Rosenzweig put it to his friend Eugen Rosenstock, quote, "Is not part of the price that the synagogue must pay for the blessing of being already in the Father's presence, that she must wear the bandages of unconsciousness over her eyes," end quote. As Rosenzweig argues at length in Part 3 of The Star of Redemption, the bandage of unconsciousness blinded Jew and Judaism particularly to politics. Rosenzweig then, like Hirsch and Cohen, can only view Judaism through the lens of an absolute separation between theology and politics. Judaism for Rosenzweig has no political dimension, but only a theological one. Resurrection, therefore, is irrelevant to Judaism. That the problem of resurrection for modern Jewish thinkers is a political one is confirmed by the fact that cultural Zionists are perhaps the only modern Jewish thinkers for whom resurrection is supremely important. The central figure of cultural Zionism, Achad Ha'am, explicitly rejected the modern idea that Judaism is religion. He discarded this modern notion because he believed that Jews had attempted to eliminate their communal identity, what I've been calling in this paper the political dimension of Judaism, for the false promise of the modern liberal state. Writing in Eastern Europe, where Jews had not yet received the rights of citizenship, Achad Ha'am made this point most clearly in a well-known and aptly titled essay, Slavery and Freedom. Quote, "Do I envy these Jews of mine their emancipation? No, 1,000 times no. I have at least not sold my soul for emancipation. I at least know why I remain a Jew, or rather, I can find no meaning in such a question, any more than if I were asked why I remain my father's son." End quote. Achad Ha'am strove to acknowledge both the political and theological dimensions of Judaism, but he sought to subordinate theology to a new kind of national identity, Zionism. Reformulating the twin theological and political dimensions of Judaism, he famously maintained that, quote, "One can say without any exaggeration that more than the Jewish people has kept the Sabbath has kept the Jewish people," end quote. Perhaps the most basic concept that Achad Ha'am attempted to transform or to resurrect was the very idea of resurrection. He explicitly suggested that political redemption for the Jews, again Zionism, was an appendage to Techiyat HaMetim, resurrection of the dead. Cultural Zionism, he maintained, would lead to the resurrection of the hearts, Techiyat HaLevavot, of the Jewish people. Martin Buber, a great admirer of Achad Ha'am's cultural Zionism, also described the reawakening of Jewish peoplehood in terms of resurrection. Quote, "The word resurrection comes to mind, a reawakening that is a miracle," end quote. Buber's use of resurrection is particularly telling because he continues that, quote, "But history knows no miracles. It does, however, know streams of national life that seem to cease but actually continue underground. The Jewish people can look forward to a resurrection from a half-life to a full one," end quote. The cultural Zionist reformulation of resurrection raises the question of whether the modern era demands that Jews make an either-or choice between religion and politics. As such, the relationship between the rejection of resurrection in modern Jewish avowals of immortality and the revival of the concept of resurrection by cultural Zionists begs the most basic questions of modern Jewish thought as well as of political modernity. Okay, I'm coming to my conclusions now. Okay. In this paper, I've tried to show that a commitment to immortality is central to modern Jewish thought, and that modern Jewish thinkers affirm immortality while rejecting or downplaying resurrection. I've suggested that this movement from resurrection to immortality ought to be understood within the theological political framework of modernity, in which Judaism is considered a religion separate from politics. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to refer briefly to an interesting column of May 2008 entitled Neural Buddhists by the New York Times columnist David Brooks. And I really do think this bears upon our discussion, so bear with me for a moment. I'm going to quote extensively from this column. Brooks notes that despite the loud voices of a new group of assertive atheists, such as Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, momentum among scientists has shifted away from hardcore materialism. The brain seems less like a cold machine. It does not operate like a computer. Brooks argues that this means that debates between atheists and believers about whether it is reasonable to conceive of a soul that survives the death of the body, and about whether understanding the brain explains away or merely adds to our appreciation of the entity that created it, is going to be a sideshow. The cognitive revolution is not going to end up undermining faith in God or immortality. It's going to end up challenging faith in the Bible. The real challenge to religious believers will come from people who feel the existence of the sacred, but who think that particular religions are just cultural artifacts built on top of universal human traits. Okay, that's Brooks. Now, I began my talk with references to Hans Jonas's 1961 Ingersoll lecture. Again, Jonas concluded his lecture by affirming that, quote, "Although the hereafter is not ours, we can have immortality when in our brief span we serve our threatened mortal affairs," end quote. Now, Jonas in particular surely would have been happy to see that some scientists have more respect for elevated spiritual states, that the mind seems to have the ability to transcend itself and merge with a larger presence that feels more real. But Jonas himself recognized that his very limited conception of immortality was a break with not just the Bible, but also with the history of Jewish and Christian thought. Jonas believed there was no option but to acknowledge this break and then to create new myths for ourselves with the full knowledge that these could only be myths. My interest has been in exploring the related political dimension of this move, which concerns nothing less than the status of modern liberalism. Our considerations of modern Jewish views of immortality raises the question of whether liberalism demands that all particular religions must become just cultural artifacts built on top of universal human traits. Now, as everybody here certainly knows, this remains the basic question of all modern religious thought, Jewish or otherwise. I don't know the answer to this question, but I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to continue thinking about it. Thank you. So, want me to?
Take some questions. Right. Professor Batnitzky will field her own questions. We have some time for questions and some dialogue.
Time is fleeting. Yes.
Did I understand correctly that Mr. Professor Cohen, that you alluded to, expressed the notion of moral morality? Is that what he was trying to say? That this continues throughout the path of humankind, perhaps in the future?
Yes. I mean, what he was trying to do, just like Kant was trying to do in Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, was to think about how could you think about religion, as Kant said, within the limits of reason alone. Cohen's book, Religion of Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism, attempts to use Jewish sources and theological ideas and how can we think about them from a rationalist perspective. So all theological concepts for Cohen ultimately are moral concepts. So it's not just that immortality is almost every theological concept that Cohen mentions is the moral task of the human being. It's everlasting in an interesting way for Cohen. It's everlasting because we can never achieve it. So it's an interesting issue there. It's not, yeah. Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, again, Ahad Ha'am himself says it's an appendage. I mean, it's this transformation of these concepts out of their theological meaning entirely and out of their, again, kind of any traditional metaphysical notions of immortality. So all he wants from that idea, I think, is the collective part. And that's kind of what I was trying to show, that nobody, on the European side, nobody wanted the collective part. And, yeah.
Immortality and redemption was in part sparked politically by
Well, I mean, I have an answer to this question, but I don't want to be too reductive, so I'm trying to. I think that the answer is that I think that's why the Jewish case is very interesting in the European context. I think that so I don't think there are any others. The only other one you would look at, I think, could look at would be Catholicism, and then they became Protestants. I mean, I think that that's really the issue there, and obviously I think there's some this is very interesting parallels between Islam and Judaism, and what's interesting in a lot of contemporary discussions about this so-called clash of civilizations between Christianity and Islam is that if you go back a few hundred years, I think that these tensions are already there in the context of Judaism's relationship to Protestantism and different kinds of attempts to work that out. I think that's what modern Jewish thought tries to do, is to kind of squeeze Judaism into this Protestant concept, and it doesn't fit, and all these things then happen. So.
Yeah, I was just curious about how, where you figured the cultural Zionists in relation to the final comment you made about modern liberalism, the status of modern liberalism. From the final comment, I would have taken it that you took modern liberalism to be sort of the undergirding political philosophy for contemporary international politics, which is quite debatable. From the former comment, with the shift to cultural Zionism, I would have thought you would have been reading 20th century political arrangements to have somehow become animated differently from the philosophical basis of the modern liberal state. And I'm just curious how you read that.
Yeah, I don't know. I can tell me if this answers the question. I mean, I think part of what I was trying to say is that Zionism in general, both political Zionism and cultural Zionism, are a rejection of liberalism, right? It's a very interesting question what kind of politics cultural Zionists wanted. It's an interesting kind. They were more like their liberal counterparts than they knew because they were very non-political. But they had certain socialist ideas, roughly said. But I think, in terms of, say, the present state of Israel, this is one of the questions there is Judaism a religion in a democratic state or not? And I think there are lots of different answers to that question, lots of different attempts to try and reconcile those two. But I think that's a lot of what goes on. And some people, what's interesting is Yeshaya Leibovich, Orthodox Jewish thinker. It's really interesting because his arguments are actually very similar to Cohen and Mendelssohn's, is that Judaism in Israel, because there is a political state, is only a religion. And that's the Orthodox argument. So all of these things, it's an interesting issue. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, I don't know. Okay, well, I hope it made sense.
What's that?
Your book was very